Hello, and welcome to this video lecture for Chapter 1, Understanding the Project Environment. So let's get started. First of all, a note about PowerPoint slides in this course. PowerPoint slides will be provided for each chapter of the course textbook, Understanding Project Management, a Practical Guide. However, the slides only provide a high-level overview of the key concepts. They do not cover each topic in as much depth as the textbook, so it is expected that the appropriate readings are completed before each class and that notes are taken during class based on the lecture and class discussions. So this is something that you should do. Don't rely 100% on the PowerPoint slides for tests and midterms because there's just not enough detail in them. The course also follows an ongoing case study from initiation to completion. This project involves the product launch of a new mobile device app. And in each week's lesson, the new concepts will be covered and demonstrated in the case study. And the following is an introduction to the case study. So I invite you now to go to Chapter 1 of the textbook and read the section entitled Introduction to the Case Study. So come on back here, just pause this video and come on back here when you're done. Okay, so we're back. So you saw the initial case study. You got a bit of an overview of it, a little background about the company, because that's where projects live. They live inside organizations, and so you were getting kind of the background of what this company, Deco Productions, is all about, and the potential project. So let's talk now about the project environment. That's the purpose of this first lesson in the first chapter of the textbook, is to talk about the environment. We're going to look at things like the definition of project and project management, something called the project life cycle, project stakeholders, constraints, and we're going to do a brief overview of structures known as programs and portfolios. So let's look at each one of those in detail. So what defines a project? Well, what makes a project is really two main things. One is it's something that is temporary. That is, it starts and it ends. It does not go on forever. And the other is that it produces something unique, something new or different. The PMI definition, PMI is the Project Management Institute, which is an organization that creates and maintains various project management standards. PMI defines a project as a temporary endeavor, so there you see the word temporary again, undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So that's the definition of a project, and that's what we're going to be studying throughout this course. Now, how do projects differ from operations? Well, within an organization, there's project work and there's operational work. Project work, as we talked about, is temporary and it produces something unique. Well, operations is really the exact opposite. It is the work within the organization that is not temporary, that is ongoing, and it's producing not unique results and products, it's identical products. So think of a car company, for example. If we think of Toyota as an example, a project would be perhaps a new design, a new model, a new feature that's going to be put into their latest Corolla, for example. The operations is the production line, where each car is produced on an ongoing basis, and each car is meant to be identical to the previous. So those are the two divisions. We're going to be looking at the way that projects are managed. Project management promotes an orderly progression from the start to the end of the project. It uses various processes and documents. This course is filled with processes, and it has lots of documents. Now, the PMI definition of project management, it is the application of skills, knowledge, and techniques to execute projects effectively and efficiently. So that's what project management is all about, is taking the knowledge and techniques that you're going to learn in this course, as well as the personal skills and so on, some of which you bring and some of which will be emphasized during the course. So bring all that to bear in order to execute projects both effectively and efficiently. Now let's look at, when we look at project management, the question is, well, how should processes be organized to achieve the best results? What is the order that we should do things? So if we think about when we create anything new, the first step should be to determine the overall parameters. Like, what are we trying to do? What's our vision of our outcome? What's our goal? How much money do we have? Um, uh, what's our due date? So some of those overall parameters are first. That's something called the initiating phase in project management. The second step to create something new is to plan for the details of the work, is to figure out, well, okay, let's look into a little more detail. Let's plan out what we want to do. Let's think about the various features that we're going to do, and let's think about the schedule of when all these things need to be done. This is the planning phase in project management terminology, where we're not creating it yet. We're planning the work. The third step is to produce the product, service, or results that we just planned. So actually create it. And that's called the executing phase. And then finally, we end the project checking the results against the original parameters, see how we did, what we learned from that. That's the closing phase. So this is what's called the project life cycle. And if we look at those four phases, that's the process that we go through on projects. We initiate, plan, execute, close. The textbook is organized according to the project life cycle. So you can see there's one chapter dedicated to initiating, a number that are dedicated to planning. We have a few that are dedicated to executing, and we have one that's dedicated to closing. There's also a special chapter 15 on project procurement that spans a few phases. So it's shown at the bottom. Your course may cover all or some of these chapters. Okay, there's another concept called process groups, and we're just going to introduce it briefly here for your awareness. A process is defined as a systematic series of actions directed to some end, and project management may be thought as a whole collection of processes. And then we mentioned that on a previous slide. Now, in addition to the concept of the project life cycle and the phases, the Project Management Institute has also defined the concept of process groups. And that's where, if you take everything that you do in project management, all of the different activities, they fall into one of these 5 process groups: the initiating process group, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. So everything you do might be an initiating process, an executing process, a closing process, a monitoring and controlling process. So they're all just defined as falling into one of those 5 groups. Now, this sometimes causes some confusion, because what the heck is the difference between a phase and a process group? Well, here's a way to look at it. And to make that even a little more confusing, they share some of the same names. Like there's an initiating process group and an initiating phase. And so it gets confusing. So here's the way you look at it. Process groups are just groups of processes. That's sort of self-evident. They're just ways to categorize processes. Phases are time periods within the project where things take place. And they are, as we've seen, relatively sequential: initiating, planning, executing, closing. Now, the relationship between them is for example, the initiating process group. All of the processes that are initiating related take place primarily during the following phase. So if we were filling this in, this would be the initiating phase. So it makes sense that most of the initiating processes take place in the initiating phase. Likewise, most of the planning processes take place in the planning phase. Most executing processes in the executing phase. I'm just going to skip over this one for a moment. And most closing processes take place in the closing phase. Now, I say most because there are times during executing where you have to replan something. Maybe there's an error, or you might have missed something. So during the executing phase, there may be some planning processes that take place. So it's not exclusive. It's where primarily take place. Now, the monitoring and controlling processes, these take place during the following phase. If we are filling this box in, monitoring and controlling processes really occur during all of the phases. If you had to choose one where the majority or a little more takes place, would be during the executing phase, but we monitor and control throughout the project. So this would be all, but it takes place through all, though a little bit more in executing. So enough about process groups. Project stakeholders is another key concept that we are going to introduce here, and we will talk more about these in a future chapter. Now, a project stakeholder, it's anyone who is involved or is affected by the project in any way. So it doesn't have to be just team members. It is many, many others. Who are the potential project stakeholders for an average project? Well, there's many. There's the project manager, the project team members, customers, clients, even competitors. The government agencies can be stakeholders. Activist groups can be stakeholders. It's neighbors, the people that live perhaps beside or near a project who could be affected are stakeholders. So there's many, many others. And why is it important to manage the relationship with project stakeholders? Well, stakeholders can affect the project. They can have an impact on the project, either positively or negatively. So it's something that we really want to make sure that we understand who our stakeholders are and manage them. We'll look at that more in Chapter 3. So this is just a brief introduction. There's a special project stakeholder called the project sponsor, and should be present on every project. The role of the project sponsor is to fund the project, is to provide the budget for the project. Someone needs to do this, and to provide overall direction. Oftentimes, the project sponsor approves various decisions, is often considered the main or the ultimate decision maker, though the project sponsor does not manage the project. Now, what is the difference? There's oftentimes a project sponsor, but we also use the word customer. And is this the same role? Well, this is a little tricky, right? Sometimes the project sponsor is the customer being the one who receives and uses the end product of the project. Sometimes it's different. Sometimes there's somebody who's funding the project, and then there's another stakeholder who's receiving it. So the project sponsor can be the customer, or they can be different roles. So it's a little bit complicated. It's not simple enough to say the project sponsor is always the customer. Now, projects are challenging, and this is due to constraints. Originally, when project management the standards were first being developed, there were three main constraints that were envisioned. That is, they were constrained by the amount of work that we wanted to do, the output of the project. That's called the scope, what we will produce. There's the time, the due date, or when it needs to complete. That's another constraint. And then finally, there's the cost, the amount of budget that's available. Now, the reason why these are constraints is they're usually very difficult. Most projects, there's a lot of scope needed in a short period of time with a limited budget. That creates tension between these, because you can probably imagine the more you want to do, the longer it takes and the more expensive. So if you reduce the budget, it's going to have a negative effect potentially on the other two. And that creates challenges, because that leads to why it's difficult to effectively manage and complete projects. Over time, additional constraints were identified. For example, quality. In some project texts, scope and quality are combined in something called performance, but it's often always, and in this text, it is separated out, where quality is another constraint, where scope defines what we're going to produce. Quality is how well it will perform. So that's another constraint. There's another constraint called resources. These are the resources, either human resources or material or equipment resources that are available to the project, and that there are often not enough of them. For example, we may have a project that needs 50 skilled workers, and we may, in our area and in our time frame, only have 20. So that's a constraint. We don't always have unlimited resources. And then finally, there's risk, the amount of risk that may be tolerated by a project, and that sometimes the more, the more you shorten the schedule or use less resources, it can increase the risk that the project may have something go wrong. So now we have these 6 constraints that are present on the project. Now, at this point, it's useful to go through an example, because constraints can sometimes be hard to understand initially. So let's look at an example. You are working on a project team with 5 team members, and they're doing something. They're creating some project, and you have a very challenging amount of work to complete, so the scope. You have a challenging budget to meet, which is the cost. You have a challenging due date, and a challenging desired functionality and performance. and you have a challenging risk profile, a desire for few or no problems. So, and you have your 5 resources. So here we see our 6 constraints. They're in balance right now because you look at this and you say, well, this is challenging, but I think we can do it. So right now our project in terms of constraints is in balance. It's challenging but doable. Now, at this point, we're just going to use one example here. As the project is about to begin, your team is reduced by 1 team member. What is the likely effect on the following? So think about this now. Your resource constraint has been affected. So it's going to ask you now, what is the likely effect on each of the other 5 constraints? And that's what we want to consider. So what's the effect going to be on scope, cost, time, quality, and risk? Now, these ones we want to determine individually. We're not building this. We're looking at each one individually. So if this happened and you had your 4 team members and you want to keep your cost, time, quality, and risk the same. You don't want to spend more money, do it in a longer period of time. You don't want to lower the quality. You don't want to increase the risk. What's the likely effect going to be on what you produce? And again, the keyword is likely. Well, think about that for a moment. Here's the answer. It's going to have a downward trend on your scope. You're probably, all things being equal, going to be able to do less with less team members, keeping all the other variables the same. Okay, let's move on. Let's go to cost. Now, let's say we're not decreasing the scope. We want the same scope. We want the same duration, the same deadline, the same quality, same risk. What's going to do to our cost? Is that going to cost more or less? Well, think about that for a moment. The answer is it's likely going to increase our costs. It's going to require more budget because we want to do the same amount of work in the same time with less people. You're probably going to have overtime. You're going to have to contract it out. It's more costly. Your team members are going to become tired because they're working longer and so on, and that increases the budget. Okay, let's reset things and say, okay, we want to keep the scope the same. We don't want to decrease it. We don't have any more budget, and we want to keep the quality and the rest the same. What's that going to do to our deadline? Are we going to be able to do it sooner or longer? Will it take us less time or more time? On average, again, the trend. Okay, think about that for a moment. It's going to increase our time. It'll take us longer to do that because of all the other variables. Okay, let's move on to quality. So again, everything's reset, same scope, same budget, same due date, same risk. What's going to happen to our quality? Is it going to go up or down? Is it going to be higher quality or less quality? Well, this one's a little easier to see. It's probably going to decrease our quality. We're going to have to cut some corners. We're going to have to not check it 2 times. We might be able to check it once and that sort of thing. And that causes more errors to occur. And then finally, if we keep the same scope, cost, time, and quality, what happens to our risk? Are we riskier or less risky? Well, our risk is going to go up. There's more of a risk of something failing, of us missing a due date and so on. So that's an example of constraints. And the key thing with constraints is that these exist on every project. And part of the role of the project manager is to constantly manage your constraints, is to constantly adjust things. You may have to, slightly decrease your scope. You might need a little more budget. You might need to affect your schedule. You might need to take on a little risk. So these are usually lots and lots of changes to these occurring. And this is why it's very effective. It's very important to have an effective relationship with your key stakeholders and to communicate with them effectively, because these are things that you'll be constantly talking to them about. Now, the last couple of concepts that we're going to talk about are some project management structures that exist around projects. And the first one is regarding portfolios. There is often a large number of potential projects that may be performed in an organization. There's usually many, many ideas of what can be done, and there are often many more things than can be done. Therefore, a number of projects need to be selected from all the things we could do in order to achieve the company's strategic objectives. And so this is the link of projects to the company's goals and objectives, is that the projects that will most further, or that may increase the profit the most, or increase revenues, or increase brand recognition, and so on, whatever those projects are selected in order to achieve the company's strategic objectives. The collection of projects to be performed is called the project portfolio of the organization. The process of managing the portfolio is portfolio management and is performed by a portfolio manager. It's a senior role. This is something that is done with usually the senior management within the organization, but it's an important role as this is how projects get selected within an organization. At this point, I invite you again to pause this video, turn to Chapter 1, and read the case study update, programs, and portfolios. So come on back here when you're done. Okay, so let's recap a little bit what happened in the textbook case study. So during the portfolio management, Deco Productions senior managers consider the following. So they looked at an update to the company's video software, an update to their systems to create physical photo books, and an update to software called DecoCam to allow for a photo assistant feature. So these were the projects that were going to be considered. They can't do them. They don't have the resources. Again, think of constraints. They don't have the physical and human resources and financial resources to do all of them. So they had to select one, and this is portfolio management in action. So number 3 was selected, an update to the DecoCam software to allow for the photo assistant feature. That was selected. So this is portfolio management in action. And what you saw in the video was another structure, which are called programs. So you saw a program formed. When a number of projects share a common business objective, it is often useful to group them together. You saw in the video that there were 4 projects that were going to need to be completed in order to create the photo assistant. So there were 4 different ones. And it's useful to group them together and have them, even though they're separate projects, they collaborate and coordinate at what's called the program level. And this allows for coordinating decisions. Oftentimes decisions that occur in one project will affect the others. And this allows for communication to take place between projects, coordinating the schedules in that oftentimes something happened in one project that affects another, and coordinating resources. It's typical that projects will share resources and that human resources will move from one project to another within a program. Programs are led by a program manager who directs the project manager of each project within the program. So the purpose of this slide is for the awareness of the existence of programs. Within the textbook case study, the other projects in the program are referred to periodically, but our focus within this course will be on the product launch project. So that's the one that we're going to follow. We're going to follow one of the 4 projects within the DecoCam program. So this gives a little background as to so there's a little recap of what I was just mentioning. This gives a little recap of what the DecoCam update is. And here are the 4 projects that I referred to before. And there's the one at the bottom, DecoCam version 4 product launch project is the one that we're following. So that's the one that we're following, but there are 3 others that we will be interacting with. So we're not going to talk about the program manager, but understand that within DecoCam, there would be a program manager who would be managing this entire program. We're going to be focusing on the project manager who's managing the DecoCam version 4 product launch project. So these are the references for today's slides. So again, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.